how much of language plays a role in the aftermath of
Yeah.
experiencing a potentially traumatic event?
That's a really interesting question. We do tend to think of these events in very sort of limiting terms. I agree, and that is why I use the phrase potentially traumatic event or
Right.
the acronym PTE, because it implies this is a nasty thing that could be traumatic for some
Mhm.
people. But there's been a little bit of research on it, not nearly enough. You can't control language. Language is slippery in that way,
Yeah.
particularly American English. I think probably here, we take nouns and make them verbs. We take verbs and make them nouns. We invent language all the time. And it's fun. It's one of the creative things about American culture, but it also means that we sometimes lose sight of what these words mean. And I think people do use the particular uh, word trauma, use it very loosely, and sometimes so loosely that they can limit themselves, and they can convince themselves that they are completely damaged by an event permanently in a long-term way because of the language use. I mean, it's one way that happens for sure.
Does that lead into placebo or nocebo by chance?
How do you mean?
Because I think if say for example, COVID happened and everyone that has been through COVID can say that they've been traumatized or
Ah,
experienced trauma. And so it's like that belief in itself leads into this idea, and that's just a going throughout your life kind of
yeah.
thing.
There's a little bit of that for sure, and there's some really interesting findings from back in the 1990s, and there was a period of time when whenever a major event happened that influenced a lot of people, that mental health professionals would rush in right away and try to offer brief mental health interventions called psychological debriefing or critical incident debriefing, etc. There are many different names for this, but it was a very common thing for a while. There'd be an earthquake somewhere, and mental health professionals would go there to offer these kind of just brief sessions to people. And sometimes, in some cases, there'd be a school shooting or something else. People would be essentially told to go see the mental health professional. But the research showed, and people felt this must be good. The mental health professionals doing it thought they were helping people. They sincerely, did it because they were generally kind-hearted people that wanted to help. But the research showed, in fact, that this kind of on-the-spot, quick debriefing did not help people, and in many cases made them worse. And the reason, it seems, turned out to be something along the lines of what we were just saying, that you imagine somebody. Here's one of the best studies was done by a group of researchers who thought they were going to demonstrate that sort of this critical incident debriefing was actually helpful, and they got people in hospital in England who had been hospitalized for an injuries due to an automobile accident. By any stretch, that's a serious event. That's a very potentially traumatic event, because it's physical injury, crash in a car, it's dangerous, life threatening, could have died, etc. And people in the hospital are recovering within the first 48 hours. They were either given some of them were given this debriefing. So the mental health professional shows up in the hospital room, says, "Hello, hi, I'm a mental health professional, part of this research we're doing," and they would what they did seemed innocuous at the time, but what they did essentially is have people tell them all about everything that happened. Tell me
Mm,
blow by blow what you went through. Praise it. Tell me what it meant to you, what it felt like, etc. Go through the whole thing, and then they tell them all about trauma. Tell them what traumas are. They encourage them to make sure you express this and don't suppress this. We're going to tell your doctor so your doctor will know about this as well. And what that seemed to do is interfere with the normal recovery process. The normal process that people go through is they gradually come to terms this thing happened, and it's not unusual for people to have a lot of intrusive imagery and thoughts, replaying what happened to them because it's provocative and life threatening. Maybe a nightmare or two to feel kind of uneasy, unsure. God, I almost died in this accident and I have these injuries. I could have been killed and now I'm harmed by these injuries. And people gradually, most people, it seems, gradually come to terms with that, and it gradually abates. But if somebody shows up in your room now in the hospital and tells you you've been through a trauma, let me tell you all about trauma. Here's a pamphlet about trauma. It's now reframing this incident for people who've gone
Mm-hmm.
through this, that they have been through a trauma, a psychological trauma, rather than they've been through something really difficult, life threatening, and they lived through it, they're injured, but they're going to be okay. It's a different way to frame it. And the research showed very clearly if you leave people alone, the vast majority of them get better on their own. But the people that got this kind of debriefing did not get better in this particular study. On average, they did not get better. And it really does seem to be about this kind of reframing what I went through as a trauma. And trauma is just basically a scary word for people, and it's a scary idea. That's basically what it boils down to.
It's so fascinating when I hear that kind of research because it kind of almost reaffirms my belief around how much almost our experience of something happening is more so the story that we tell ourselves about the experience rather than the actual experience in itself. And so talking about it seemingly what you'd think would make it positive, but if they're telling you all the negative that could come from it or how traumatic that experience can be, you're only kind of feeding that narrative into their minds. And it
Yeah.
leads me to something that you've said in prior podcasts that if everything is a traumatic event, then it's not my fault for responding this way.
Yes.
And
It,
I definitely want to dive into coping ugly because I love that perspective. But is there ever a reasonable time to call something an actual trauma, or what's your perspective on that?
well, the word is complicated. I mean, we have the word, right? We could come up with a new word, but we tend to think. I think what we have tended to do is think about, and I think this is professionally what the actual prescription still seems to be. If a period of time has gone by since somebody was exposed to something life threatening or really dangerous, something potentially traumatic, and they're not getting better. And that time is somewhat arbitrarily been set at 1 month. 1 month is a long time, right? We know from all the research that's been done that most people will be pretty upset in those first few weeks. Most people will have a lot, as I said before, a lot of intrusive imagery, maybe a nightmare or two. They'll be uneasy. They'll be kind of shaken by what happened, but that abates for most people. If that doesn't go away past for at least 1 month, and this is again sort of arbitrary, but it's a long period of time, then we can start to worry. Then we can start to think that maybe there is a post-traumatic stress reaction. This is where we start getting into the realm of PTSD. And that doesn't necessarily mean somebody now has PTSD and they're, even if they get the diagnosis, you can't, technically the diagnosis isn't possible until 1 month. So say 1 month passes and the person now has plenty of symptoms, they're struggling, they get the PTSD diagnosis. That still does not mean that they're now going to be traumatized for the rest of their life or even for the next 2 weeks. It just means they're experiencing this elevated level of trauma to warrant this disorder at this point in time. And it may go away. And what our research has shown is for some subset of people, they continue to show high levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms for several years or more. A small subset of people do that. Another subset of people experience these very intense acute reactions that it takes them a while, like often more than a year, to kind of get back into the normal level, maybe 2 years. So we see that pattern as well. There are different ways that people will react to these things, but it's really about the passage of time. When a certain amount of time has passed and people are not getting better, that's when we start getting into the realm of this was a trauma that's causing lasting emotional damage.